A very good evening, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all who are tuned in to today's webinar organized by Gulf International Forum on climate change in the Gulf. My name is Amin Mohseni, and I'm an assistant professor of economics at American University in Washington, D.C., and a non-resident fellow at Gulf International Forum. It is my pleasure and honor to have the opportunity of moderating the program today. The consequences of climate change throughout the Gulf region have become a more serious problem in recent years. Today, some areas are facing severe droughts, such as the GCC countries to the south of Gulf, while others are facing unprecedented floods, such as areas in southern Iran. Overall, the region's climate has changed drastically over the past 5 decades, and it is projected that some Gulf states will experience a temperature increase of 2.6 degrees Celsius and a nearly 35% decline in precipitation over the next 30 years. The impact of these changes are already being felt. Water scarcity has introduced significant challenges for agricultural and industrial sectors in the region. Meanwhile, urban expansion in GCC states has placed considerable pressure on their limited water resources and infrastructure plans. Ultimately, if the growing crisis are not addressed effectively and in a timely manner, the drastic increase in temperature and decrease in water supplies will render some areas as inhabitable, reduce arable land, bring down economic productivity, and lead to high levels of food insecurity and social strife, among many other concerns. The socioeconomic impacts of such changes cannot be overstated. So what are some of the major climate change challenges in the Gulf, and to what extent has the environmental degradation has proceeded in the region? If the current trajectory is maintained, what will be the consequences for the region in 50 years? How can governments, businesses, and consumers respond to these drastic climate consequences? What are the obstacles to cooperative environmental policy-making measures? What measures can the Gulf states take to diversify their economies and fight climate change, and what political and economic obstacles could hold them back? These are some of the questions that our esteemed panelists today will try to address in today's webinar entitled Climate Change in the Gulf, Challenges and Solutions. Let me start introducing our panelists. We will start today's discussion by Professor Cristina D'Alessandro. She's an associate researcher at Prodige Research Center at the University of Paris, Sorbonne, and an affiliate associate professor at Riara University in Nairobi, Kenya. Her research focuses on urban planning, management and transformation, natural resources and environmental governance, political, economic, and territorial governance, and institutional capacity building and leadership. She has over 20 years of academic and policy research experience with international organizations, including African Development Bank, UN Women, and the United Nations Economic Commissions for Africa, among many others. Our second speaker will be Dr. Nadim Farajalla. He is the director of the Climate Change and the Environment Program at the American University of Beirut's Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. Dr. Farajalla's current research focuses on the impact of climate change on human settlements and activities through extreme events of flooding, droughts, impacts of climate change on security, and the nexus of water, energy, food, and climate change with focus on adaptation and resilience. Our last speaker will be Dr. Aisha Al-Sarihi. She's a research associate at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. Dr. Sarihi's research interest focuses on environment, energy policy, and climate economics and policies. She was also a researcher at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, studying the challenges and opportunities for aligning climate policies with economic diversification strategies in Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE. Very warm welcome to all of you, dear guests, to this program. So without further ado, allow me to pass the floor to Dr. D'Alessandro to provide us with an 8 to 9 minutes discussion around urban governance and planning, institutional capacity building, and localizing the SDGs in urban context of the Gulf states. Dr. D'Alessandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here with you today, and I would like to thank, first of all, the Gulf International Forum and its executive director, Dr. Tanya Taffer, for organizing the event and for inviting me. I also would like to thank Dr. Mohseni for this perfect introduction. Thank you very much. My contribution today is going to highlight a critical challenge. That's what I would like to do, and just point a few suggestions. To start, talking about climate change in the Gulf, its challenges and solutions, what spaces are we talking about? In the Gulf intended as Gulf Cooperation Council states, so the GCC states, more than 80% of the population is urban, up to 99% in Qatar, for example. Important cities, metropolises, and capital cities are on the coast. Henceforth, climate change has an important urban dimension in the Gulf. Consequently, sea level rise in urban spaces is a critical concern in the region, calling for appropriate urban planning and urban governance, which is challenging, including sound national policies for sustainable urban adaptation. I recently, in 2019, co-authored with Dr. Laurent Lambert from the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies a paper available online on the Middle East Institute website on this topic, on sustainable urban adaptation in the Gulf against sea level rise. And in this paper, we argue that preventing and protecting cities from sea level rise means basically three things. First, developing the needed techniques, projects, measures, and innovation to fight against sea level rise in urban spaces. Second, ensuring state engagement against these issues, but also stakeholders' participation and wide stakeholders' participation. Third, developing regional and beyond international collaborations to share ideas and experiences. To this extent, city-to-city cooperation, a form of North-South or South-South cooperation, depending on cases, is an avenue that, in my opinion, could be developed more in the Gulf, as Gulf countries can share with countries in the Global South their technological knowledge and expertise. Gulf states can also learn from policy experiences and solutions developed elsewhere where sea level rise is a concern, like, for example, in Africa. In many African cities, some solutions have started to be developed and some policies in urban contexts have been developed. The same has been done for other issues, like, for example, natural resource governance, when, for example, the Qatar National Research Fund financed a project titled Natural Resource Governance in Africa, Lessons for Qatar, a few years ago. This is, in my opinion, what localizing the sustainable development goals really entails. What organizations such as the United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG, and the United Nations work on, and what the SDGs are supposed to bring. They are supposed to bring changes at every level, including the most local, and I would say starting from the most local, through SDG 11, in this case, on sustainable cities. And this is particularly relevant in the Gulf, as Gulf states like Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates have national development plans or national visions for development, focusing on achieving sustainable development and implementing the SDGs as an avenue for economic diversification, for diversifying their economies. Finally, in the Gulf, sustainable urban adaptation against sea level rise may be a further opportunity, among others, for the private sector and for entrepreneurship development. And we know how important this is, meaning job creation, but also skills development, institutional and individual capacity building, for developing, for example, in the case of sea level rise, innovative building materials, technical solutions, or for building appropriate infrastructure to protect neighborhoods more at risk. To conclude, in my opinion, no state or city can succeed alone in fighting against climate change. It is a global issue for which sharing expertise, techniques, knowledge, experiences, and eventually failures has proved to be critical and a successful way to implement sustainable development. I thank you very much for your attention. And I will stop here for now.
Thank you, Dr. D'Alessandro. Yes, I never thought about this aspect of sea level rises and in the Gulf region, with most of the cities in the Gulf being next to the Gulf exactly, and the rising sea levels can be detrimental for these cities. Dr. Farajalla, can you please walk us through some of the security, food and water security, specifically social, political, and economic dynamics of climate change in the Gulf region, please?
I will. Thank you very much,
Dr.
Mohseni, for this nice introduction. I would like to thank Anas Al-Qaid for making this happen easily, and for Dr. Dania Dhafer for inviting me and this esteemed panel to this most interesting panel. I mean, this is a nice approach for what we have. Let me let me start with a different outlook. I have not prepared something written, but I'm going to go with what we've been working with for the past 20 years, practically, in the Middle East and also in the Gulf countries. The main challenges in that climate change is posing in an area that is already water scarce is increasing aridity mostly, and increased temperatures. It is expected that most of the Arabian Peninsula will suffer from lower precipitation. It's already low, it's going to become lower. The more positive aspect, but there is also a catch to that, is that the monsoon would drive a little bit more northerly and will come in with more rain for countries like Oman, parts of Saudi Arabia. Jeddah will benefit a little bit from this, and Yemen as well. The problem with this increased precipitation from the monsoon is that the infrastructure that is already in place had been designed for low intensity rainfall. So with this increased intensity that will come in from the monsoon, the infrastructure might not be able to handle it. So we are going to be faced with another problem, which is, as Dr. Alessandro mentioned, the rising sea levels. And rising sea levels are not the problem per se, maybe, but they are. There is also added to that, on top of that, is the storm surge. If the sea level rises 30, 40 centimeters, the storm surge is going to be magnified even more. So a typical storm that results in a 1 to 2 meter high wave is going to, in the future, result in higher waves. So what's the problem here? All the infrastructure that's along the coast is subject to either inundation or damage from the waves. Waves are very violent manifestation of nature. So what this will mean is that most saltwater desalination, seawater desalination plants are along the coast, and their protection is limited to what is currently or what had been the case before. So these desalination plants are going to be subject to damage and infrastructure damage. Also, all of the roads, the Corniche, for example, in Jeddah, and if you take any other corniche along the coast in either the Red Sea or the Arabian Gulf or in Oman or Yemen, these areas are going to be subject to severe storm surges and sea level rises. They're going to damage infrastructure. So more money is going to be needed to be sunk into the warding off on this. Another thing that is important is that the rising temperature is going to demand more use of energy to cool down buildings and refrigerate food and cool water. So the demand is going to rise. Rising demand means more local consumption of oil. Also, the rising temperature means people and plants and animals are going to need more water. So more desalinization is going to occur. So there's more energy that's going to be demanded by this sector to meet the water needs of the increased water needs. So less oil and in some cases gas is going to be needed to is going to be available for export, so lower income coming in from oil and gas. So this is an economic conundrum. It's not only about a resource that's water, it is linked into all these. In addition, the increased use of water, Saudi Arabia, for example, relies the least on desalinization, but the use of fossilized water, for example, fossil groundwater, which is water that is not replenished anymore, is increasing, and it is also the renewed part of the groundwater is going to be depleted, inviting more and more desalinization to occur so that the water quality in these sources will deteriorate. So it is an intricate problem. What to do about this? Many things. The Gulf countries are already on track using their unified water strategy, which is good. This is at least they are all now singing from the same hymn page. This allows more cooperation and coordination. But the problem in the Gulf countries and in many countries around the world, not only the Gulf countries, is that the focus in the water sector has been to increase supply. And increasing supply from desal, because that's the most readily available fresh water resources, are very, very limited in the Gulf countries, with the exception of Oman, for example, and a little bit Saudi Arabia. But they are still way below the averages. So we need to start working on managing the use of this water, the consumption of this water. We need to go into something called demand management. We also need to make sure that we stop subsidizing directly the consumption of water. Because when people feel that water is available and free and they have no concern about it, they abuse it. They use it more than they should. So this is where the attention should go. We need to manage the demand so that we reduce consumption, we fix leaks at home in the network, we reduce agricultural water use, which is way too high, and it is inconsequential in the Gulf countries. The demand for water in the rural areas in agriculture needs to be curtailed. Rural communities need to be retrained or afforded some other form of income to maintain their livelihood in dignity, their right, this is a right, but also to make sure that the Gulf countries can import the food that they need without having to grow it in. Food security is not about food self-sufficiency. Food security is about access to food, nutritious food, in amounts and quantities that are needed for everybody. So this food security aspect, when we couple it with water security, does not mean growing it locally. We can import it. The Gulf countries have already started establishing farms overseas to start this process. This needs to be done in an equitable and fair manner, because it is not that equitable right now. So importing food, making sure that it is available to the population, reducing demand, and making sure that the energy is available for not only producing, desalinating water, but recycling and reusing sewage water and brackish water. So all this tripolar, if you will, system of water, energy, and food have to be done together, so that the development of the GCC countries can keep pace of its current development. I think I'll stop now and make myself available to other questions when we get a chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farajalla. That was very interesting way of laying out the challenges with the infrastructure challenges in the region, that if the sea levels rise, the desal plants themselves can be under a big threat. And as you mentioned, there is a multifaceted approach is needed. One we need demand management through making water less subsidized, if not freely 100% unsubsidized, and water tariffs should definitely go up in the region. As an economist, I have done some work on that, and I know in the region the water consumption is many times the global average per person, per capita. And also the new supplies. The region mainly is focusing on desalination, which is damaging the Gulf through brine production. And it should, I think, as a whole region, new technologies should be brought on board and researched about. But let's just move on to Dr. Sarihi. I think we have left the most challenging part for her. In your opinion, what are some of the practical and realistic policies and measures the Gulf countries need to adopt immediately to avoid or reduce the severity of the many challenges of the climate change in the region that was mentioned the past few minutes? And can these countries actually cooperate on a common objective and goal moving forward?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Amin, for the introduction and for the questions. I also join my voice to the panelists on thanking the Gulf International Forum for organizing this event. I'm happy to be with everyone here. And yes, I think I have difficult questions to answer, but also what I want to say, it is hard to talk about climate change and not link it to the energy sector, especially for the Gulf countries, where the oil and gas sector plays a major role in their economy. And also, given the high reliance of the Gulf countries on oil and gas exports, and given also the growing global momentum to cut greenhouse gas emissions through the reduction of the consumption of the fossil fuels, especially after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, it's also hard not to think about what could be the implications for the Gulf economies, especially on the oil and the revenues that comes from the oil, and whether the implications of growing climate action could impose similar challenges as those of oil price collapse and what we have seen most recently, the COVID-19, the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, given that there are also many uncertainties surrounding the speed of the global transition towards adopting alternative energy technologies. I think such external factors might not put enough pressure for the GCC countries to advance their climate action domestically, at least at the short and mid-term level. And I think what would trigger or speed up or motivate the Gulf countries to advance their climate action, as Dr. Nadim mentioned, it would stem from the need to addressing domestic economic and social challenges that are important to maintain or sustain normal life. And as Dr. Nadim mentioned, examples of those challenges is the water scarcity and then also the growing need of cooling. So as we know, the Gulf country is characterized by harsh environment with hot and semi-arid climate. And given that it already has some of the lowest water availability levels on their capita basis in the world, the rising in the temperature, the high evaporation rates, the low rainfall, all these are triggering the Gulf countries to search for alternative sources of water. And currently, the water desalination, seawater desalination, is meeting around 10% to 50% of the water needs in the Gulf countries. And as Dr. Nadim mentioned, these are most of the desalination processes rely on the fossil fuel based thermal technologies, and these are putting pressure on the energy resources in the GCC countries. Same goes also for the cooling. Because of the hot water, there's there's an increasing need for cooling, which accounts currently for something between 60 to 80% of GCC household electricity consumption. And it is expected to increase or treble by the 2050 because of many factors such as the growth in the population, as well as the rising impact of global warming. So the reason I brought those examples, which are energy-related examples, is to show that energy and water sectors present entry points for climate action in the GCC. And throughout my research that I have been doing and looking at the importance of aligning climate action with the economic development, it seems that the development of, for example, addressing the challenges that meeting the energy and water sector through, for example, the development of clean energy, like renewable energy technologies, enhancing energy efficiency programs, and doing the water desalination using low carbon technologies or less energy intensive technologies. These would help in meeting the increasing demand, and at the same time they will bring other co-benefits, including the enhancing the energy security and other, and they would generate other economy-wide benefits and returns, including the reduced dependence on the fossil fuel and the creation of new industries and the generation of green jobs. And so also reflecting from those examples, Advancing domestic climate action in the GCC would help in achieve multiple co-benefits beyond just cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And these include, so first of all, for the Gulf countries to join the global forces in cutting greenhouse gas emissions, that would be actually wouldn't only help on cutting, reducing the global temperature, but also helping reducing the adverse effect of climate change at home as well. Also, considering addressing the risks and opportunities of climate change in line with the development of the oil and non-oil sectors would help ensuring long-term resilience and sustainability of the economic sector. So specifically for the oil industry, if we take early action to reducing the risk of, for example, the exposure to international measures such as the environmentally designed trade measures, like the border carbon taxes, this will help in enhancing the resilience of conventional, what I call the conventional economic sector, because as we know, in the Gulf countries, economic diversification so far is pretty much focused on expanding the downstream industries. So, and also one of the approaches, so the Gulf countries do understand this kind of challenge. And here in Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is adopting a circular carbon economy approach, which helps in continue expanding in the fossil fuel industry, but at the same time minimizing the greenhouse gas emissions. And also, as I mentioned earlier, advancing climate action would help to contribute in economic diversification and creation of jobs beyond the conventional diversification. And this is, for example, in the case of the renewables and the energy efficiency, they can enhance the energy security and they create new economic sectors and jobs along the value chain through, for example, enhancing the involvement of small, medium enterprises as well as the private sector. So have said that, and I will try to conclude now. So the GCC countries do recognize the importance of addressing climate change, its challenges and solutions in pursuit of economic diversification co-benefits. And so far, there are different aspects of climate action has been incorporated into economic development and diversification. An example that I can give is the UAE Green Growth Strategy. However, I would say what needs to be, what we need to do more of is to enhance the implementation and fulfill the implementation gap, and also to address many challenges that face the integration of climate action into the GCC economies. And these include the low data and information profiles, weakness in the implementation of environmental protection and climate-related regulations. In some cases, there is an absence of climate action plan and also fragmentation of environmental and climate-related policies and efforts. Also, the Gulf countries need to pay attention on addressing some of the human and technical capacity and on thinking where to allocate the financial resources to achieve tangible alignment between economic development and addressing the climate change. And So these are the points that I wanted to touch on, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Sarihi. I really appreciate your presentation. So we have some questions from the audience, and I have my own questions as well. I'll leave my own questions to the last, just to be fair for the audience. So there is a question regarding workers' rights. It says that recent studies have shown that migrant population workers are more vulnerable to pollution and heat in the Gulf region. How should this environmental justice issue be approached socially and politically? I think Dr. D'Alessandro, if you want to take a shot at that, we would be grateful.
Sorry, could you repeat, please?
Yes. So the question says that recent studies have shown that migrant workers are more vulnerable to pollution and heat in the Gulf region. How should this environmental justice issue be approached socially and politically in the Gulf?
Socially and politically. Well, this is a huge question. Thank you very much. And I think it cannot be answered in 3 minutes. I think this is the huge problem of climate migrants. That is not only an issue in the Gulf, but actually it's an issue everywhere, and especially in the global South. For example, in Africa, to quote a region I know better. I think in the Gulf, from my view, socially speaking, the issue is the concentration of migrant population in some areas and in some countries, and the fact that they are not divided equally. I mean, they are not equally divided among the countries and among the parts. I mean, among the places in the country. So that's a problem that, in my opinion, has to be addressed in the best way through policymaking and of course through security measures. For the political issue of it, I think the best way to address this kind of issue is regional integration and addressing migration with regional policies that are concerted, that are aligned and harmonized, addressing migration. This is not easy, I agree, but it can be done in some way. For example, one of the regions that in Africa has done it, and it has a lot of internal migration, not only linked to climate change, but also linked to climate change, but also to insecurity, is Southern Africa. And for instance, the SADC has worked on this, has worked on security issues, has worked on climate migration, and I guess now that things are evolving and the African Continental Free Trade Area has been enforced in that part of Africa, this will help to address this kind of problem. So equally, I think when it comes to Gulf country, to the GCC, in my opinion, this is the type of responses that can be given socially and politically speaking to these kind of issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. D'Alessandro. So there is another question that maybe Dr. Sarihi can take a shot at. And the question goes that given the contribution of oil and gas majors to climate change, should the population in the Gulf call on national oil companies for more transparency in terms of disclosures, including Scope 3 emissions? Dr. Sarihi, would you like to?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
One part of the answer to the question, I think the involvement of GCC citizens in addressing the climate change is important, but also I think what important thing that I want to also highlight on is that the transition to a low carbon economy is not something that is going to happen overnight. And given that the oil and gas sector plays a major role in the GCC economies, and also given that the GCC countries are trying to find out alternative approaches that reduce the emissions that comes from the oil industry, I think at this, I think it's going to be a long-term process. And indeed, the transparency is important, and also the involvement of the citizens in reducing the emissions is also important. But I think if the GCC countries can find out alternative solutions like the circular carbon economy approach, which can be, which can help, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that comes from the value chain of the oil and gas sectors, including the up and mid and the downstream. I think that would help in also facilitating the transition in a gradual manner.
Thank you, Dr. Sarihi. Dr. Farajalla, there is a question regarding the global implication of water scarcity and flooding in the Gulf region. We understand that the region itself is is going to be threatened significantly, but what is the global implication of such threats to the Gulf?
The problems are oil related, I would dare say. The terminals out of which oil is exported are coastal. There are these facilities are at risk from increasingly more violent storms and increasingly rising sea levels. So these facilities might be, or the operation of these facilities might be disrupted. Work in urban cities, as Dr. Alessandro was saying, I mean, 90% of population practically of in Qatar, for example, are in urban areas, and close to 80% and even more are around the GCC live in cities. And we have seen examples these past 2-3 years of severe flooding in Jeddah and Riyadh, and in other places in the Gulf. And this disruption of normal life in these countries would reduce commercial activities related to oil and gas. So that's on the global side. But to me, I would rather want to focus also on what does it mean to the locals, to the citizens and the residents of these countries. This is becoming a problem. Billions of dollars worth of damage is being incurred from these violent storms, and some not even violent, some excessive rainfall is causing flooding and damage to infrastructure, and this is disrupting food supplies between one area and another, between the port area and inland, and this is something that is going to be problematic. The problem with climate change and its impacts is not, it is global in its nature. For example, if the food that is exported into the Gulf countries, wheat, for example, now that Saudi Arabia has stopped growing its own wheat to the extent that it was, they rely on, all Arab countries rely on wheat from Russia, from the Ukraine, from Argentina, from Australia, from the US, Canada. Not very long ago, 2009, 2010, there were huge fires in Russia that disrupted the export of wheat. At the same time there was flooding in Pakistan, which disrupted their import more than foods became problematic. That's the problem we need to worry about. This is how we need to keep we have seas to and then building of the cities along the coast are into the sea. We need to be building inland, creating corridors.
Okay, I think, Dr. Farajalla, we lost the last portion of your talk. There was some internet issues, but if I understand correctly, the issue globally is mainly through the damage to the oil infrastructure and gas infrastructure in the Gulf region from the rising high sea levels and also the storms that could cause by it. But from human migration perspective, I mean, so this question can Dr. D'Alessandro would like to address it from an SDG perspective. So, given the the rising sea levels, and given that the GCC countries they are mostly urban, what can we expect to happen if these rising sea levels are not addressed in terms of migration of populations from these cities, and where would these populations go in the Arabian Peninsula if that becomes the case?
Well, thank you very much. Here, the question, in my opinion, is micro-local because some neighborhoods are more affected because they are more on the coast. So I don't think that this is the same type of migration that the climate migration can engender. This would be more a local migration of moving neighborhoods, of protecting the neighborhoods that are more exposed to sea level rise. So I think this would be more accommodating the city in such a way that the neighborhoods that are more exposed could be protected, and that maybe the city stops advancing into the or closer to the sea, and so even if some population from the neighborhoods that are more exposed would have to be moved, I guess this is the type of migration that will remain in the city or in the edges of the city, but would not change completely a region or country like climate migration for agricultural purposes or for food purposes could engender. This is, I guess, another type of migration that are more local consequences. I don't hear you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I was muted. So I have a question of my own to the panelists, if you don't mind. So we know the population in the Gulf region has quadrupled in the past four decades, from 46 million in 1970, now to 183 million in 2020, including Iran and Iraq as well, of course. And at the same time, the water supply has stayed more or less the same. The rainfalls has decreased actually, and the underground water has been depleted. So there is this rising demand and I'm sure and decreasing supply. So the main technology, the go-to technology has been desalination, and the brine production from this desalination has made the water in the Gulf to become more salinated. From what I read from statistics, around 55% of total global brine production happens in the Gulf region. And all this brine is being dumped back in the Gulf with detrimental environmental consequences for the Gulf. So what kind of new technologies can we look towards to? Can we look optimistically be looking towards that can address this heavy demand on desalination. I understand that there is also still there is more investments on expensive desalination plants for future. But can we shift our attention from desalination a little and look outside the box and look at new technologies like AWGs, atmospheric water generators, and such technologies that is more environmentally friendly in the long run? Dr. Sarihi, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of desalination and how it is being done across the Gulf countries, there are two types of the technologies that are used so far. One is the fossil fuel-based thermal desalination technology, and this is basically relies on the oil and gas for its operation. And the other technology is reverse osmosis technology. And this is, to my understanding, it is of low energy intensity. And in terms, so country specific, my understanding that, for example, in Oman, 60% of the desalination happens through reverse osmosis. And I think a huge part of the desalination also in Saudi Arabia is also done through this new technology, which is reverse osmosis. So the reason, and I think the planned contracts for providing desalination, they would also now rely on this reverse osmosis technology. So the reason why it hasn't been used in the first place, it was the cost of it. But now the cost is declining, and it is for the advantage of the Gulf countries to rely on alternative technology, which doesn't depend on the oil and gas, so they can free the oil and gas for other needs. So specifically here that economic diversification itself relies on the oil and gas supplies, including, for example, expansion of the petrochemical and other industries. So it's also giving that low carbon intensity of the oil supplies, especially in the Saudi Arabia. It would make the case for exporting more oil in the international market, even if there are, carbon border taxes in there. So this is, but in terms of brine water that comes out of it, I am not really sure how the Gulf countries can deal with it, because it is not my specialty in this area.
Thank you, Doctor. So let's talk about some good news. If there are any, if you guys know of any good developments, steps taken in the right direction in the Gulf region, some case studies that we can point to, that we can build upon moving forward to address these challenges. This is a question for any of the panelists.
Look, if I may jump in.
Of course.
For every problem, every cloud has silver lining in a storm. And the silver lining in this, you just touched upon it a little bit, in that this need, this scarcity and our need to address scarcity has generated opportunities for industry in the Gulf countries. For example, you just said, first, let's start with desalination. Desalination, the two components that Dr. Sarihi said are flash distillation, reverse osmosis, but then there is nanotechnology that allows nanofiltration. So with nanofiltration, that's another, all of them rely on fossil fuel. However, the advancement in renewable energy, photovoltaics, coupling that with water This is advancing quickly. The United Arab Emirates are quite advanced in their activities in renewables. Saudi Arabia is picking up on that. These are technologies that are mutually supportive. In Oman, they are harvesting, and they have been harvesting fog for a long, long time. Yemen does it in bits and pieces. So that is something that we can do. We can also make use of tidal variation using tidal energy generation from the sea. These are all available. Technologies for renewable energies can stimulate local industries, and they have to great extent. Yemen now, if you look at Yemen, given its problems right now and the lack of electricity, the amount of renewable energy, solar photovoltaics that are being used, installed, and built in Yemen is phenomenal. So there is a problem, there is a solution, and the industry of the Gulf countries is there. I mean, the people have existed for millennia. They are good traders. They have made themselves indispensable in the region. So this is an opportunity to work collaboratively to generate, to develop industry that's mutually supportive. So there is a lot going for this, but at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the, as Dr. Sarihi said, the ability to divest. The reliance, over-reliance on oil and gas has to end sooner than later. And this can be done and should be done using the money generated by oil and gas. Thank you.
Let me follow up on that, because there is a question from the audience saying that, okay, yes, these countries, they should reduce their dependence on oil and gas and they should diversify, but their economies are heavily dependent on oil and gas. What else these countries can do in that part of the world? I mean, the agriculture is basically non-existing because of water scarcity. What else can they do to diversify their economies moving forward? Some tangible, feasible suggestions from the panelists.
May I jump in?
Of course, please.
Thank you. I would say that there are various examples, and I was quoting, for example, Qatar with the Qatar National Vision 2030, but others could be Kuwait and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. These national development visions and plans that are with the visions, that come with the visions, showcase how there are possibilities and how it is implemented to find other ways to see resources and to diversify the economy, for example, through capacity building, putting together new skills, and in the case of Qatar, but not only Qatar, putting the SDGs and sustainable development at the core of the national development plan. And so twisting the economy progressively to create new competencies, new skills, new training, and also to invest, for example, in tourism, in other sectors that probably were already there, but were not used at the full potential that they could have. And of course, this is a long process, and it does not take place only in 1 year, but it is a path. And I believe that putting together a national vision that is a clear line according to which set in place policies that are coherent and follow this path, this is a good way on the longer term in changing not only the economy, but more deeply the society, creating new skills, new avenues, new jobs, and also giving to the youth possibilities to remain in the country and not only to migrate to find a job if oil and gas are not anymore the possibilities that they were in the past.
Thank you. Does anybody else wants to comment on that?
Can I jump in?
Of course, please.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Professor Alessandro. I think the human capital is the alternative fuel of the economy for the Gulf countries, especially the population is rising, the youth segment is also rising, and the demand for the jobs is also in the rise. I think in terms of the oil sector, well, it is the main source of income, and it accounts for a huge segment of the economy. But also, this sector is pretty much dominated by large companies, which doesn't necessarily gonna provide the or meet the needs for the new jobs for the growing population in the region. So I think alternatively, there are other alternative options that could be pursued. And in terms of the energy, the clean energy, which I focus on the area, I think if we could remove the barriers to small, medium enterprises and enhance the involvement and the participation of the private sector in the economy, we maybe in the clean energy and the other sectors as well, we could also not only enhance the economic diversification, but also enhance or move towards the aspiration of building a knowledge-based economy in the region. And I think it's already happening. The contribution of small, medium enterprises in the GCC economies is increasing, although not at a high speed. And so, yeah, I mean, enhancing the role of small, medium enterprises is key, and also like reflecting on the rise of the or currently the consideration of the value-added taxes in the GCC. We now see that the value-added tax has been introduced most recently in Oman and the UAE, and in case of Saudi Arabia, it has been increased from 5 to 15% most recently. So we are trying to look to alternative sources of income, and through the taxes, the way we can do it, it's not pretty much to rely only on the large companies, but also to engage everyone in the process, especially the private sector.
Thank you, Dr. Sarihi. Just to follow up on that, so we know that in the GCC countries, the subsidies on energy, on fossil fuel subsidies are tremendous. It has declined a bit in some countries over the past years because of the budget pressures that they had, but it's still, there are immense fossil fuel subsidies. I don't have the figures for GCC countries in particular, but I know for MENA region as a whole, the fossil fuel subsidies are costing around, let me actually look at the figure here, 13% of the region's GDP. This is a report from IMF. And, you know, it's an oxymoron to talk about, for example, renewable energies, and then on the other hand, you have the governments in the region providing massive subsidies for fossil fuels still. So I think the first step in that direction of diversification is to reduce these fossil fuel subsidies in the first step, to make the level, the playing field level, so that renewables can compete much more easily in this industry. And then, you know, moving forward, we take, you know, smaller steps towards, you know, diversification. I know, for example, for the case of Qatar Foundation has this education city. They have this fintech hub at QFC, Qatar Financial Center. So the human capital that was mentioned is definitely something that the region is focusing on in higher education and also in high tech and entrepreneurship skills. But when it comes to the issue of subsidies, there is a huge political economic dynamics behind it, removing especially fossil fuel subsidies. If you want to talk about a couple of minutes, any of the speakers on this issue, that how can the governments realistically reduce fossil fuel subsidies and promote renewable energy and green economy moving forward in order to be able to address this issue of climate change in the region. Dr. Farajalla, do you want to go ahead? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, definitely. I would like to address the subsidy issue not only in the oil and the energy sector. It is pervasive, especially in the water sector. When you look at how much subsidy, about 10% of the water sector's needs are met through subsidies in many places, at least. And that goes, for example, for a well. If you want to drill a well, permits are being maybe withheld or made difficult, but then they subsidize, the governments subsidize well components. So you can drill a well at nothing, right, next to nothing. And the cost recovery in terms of making your water establishments and water utilities self-sufficient is problematic. There is not enough money for cost recovery. And the tariffs that people are charged are invariably lower than what is needed. And then, so when you move to the energy sector makes water available cheap because the oil is readily available. It is used in desalination, which makes water relatively cheap. And people get water relatively cheaply, or they don't pay for it, so they waste it. So there is that link that needs to be broken. So oil being available cheaply has to stop, and people have to pay the real cost of acquiring water. That linkage has to stop. And governments are not doing their citizens any favors by supplying them with this cheap oil, because down the road, and that's not very far off, this oil is not going to be there. It's going to be very expensive to get it, and it's going to cost more to get water. So people, by breaking that link and taking some of that subsidy money and investing it in renewables and supporting, as Dr. Aisha really stated nicely, supporting your innovation in your countries, that subsidy going in there makes the economy go in a different direction rather than heavy reliance on oil. So once that starts moving in that direction, it builds up momentum and critical mass, and then it gains life of its own. Then that subsidy that you were putting in oil can then now be given to another sector that supports. Definitely capacity building is an issue that can go there. So there is a lot that can be done, a lot of innovation, a lot of hard love, if you will, tough love. We cannot be cuddled all the time and, oh yeah, have some water for free, have some oil for free, it's okay. The food you get is going to be, because everything gets subsidized. And then when that subsidy is forcibly removed, you will get into social tension, which leads to political tension, which leads to chaos, and everything collapses. So there is that. It is not easy. It is easier to start it now and then build up on it. Thank you.
Definitely, Dr. Yes. Dr. D'Alessandro, do you want to have a comment on that?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to say the subsidies by itself can be changed by policies, but economic policies are very powerful. But in this case, this would come from a process. I mean, removing subsidies can be done from today to tomorrow. These subsidies are parts of, life of people, are parts of societies. So to remove them, it means that habits and way of producing energy and using energy or water have to change, and this has to be done through a process. So shifting from non-renewable to renewable and clean energies, in my opinion, in countries that heavily rely from oil and gas, has to be done by intermediate steps. So going through oil and gas reliance to cleaner energies and cleaner solution, even if they are not completely clean, is already a step forward. For example, LNG. LNG is a cleaner form of energy, although it's not a renewable, although it is not completely clean, yes, but it is a way to move the technology and also to develop technical cooperation, for example. It has been seen, again, I come to Qatar because it's what I know better, but the cooperation between Qatar and countries in Eastern Africa, and not only Eastern Africa, now more countries in Africa, to develop LNG technology, LNG platform, to produce gas and to sell gas to other states. It is a step forward in the direction of relying on a cleaner form of energy and developing technology that develop a mentality, that develop processes that go toward and that move towards to a cleaner process. And I believe that this is a way to progressively move in the right direction.
Yes, the processes are very important, Doctor. Yes, in terms of people's habits, businesses' habits, consumers, and so forth. Yes. Dr. Sarihi, do you want to have a comment on this?
Yes, please, if I can. So I will just add to what Dr. Farajalla and Alessandro have said. What I want to say, so maybe the climate action in the GCC wouldn't necessarily stem from the intention to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at first place, but it would stem from the economic challenges. And since the drop of the oil prices in 2014, some of the Gulf countries has already started to look at the fossil fuel subsidies, either in terms of the subsidies that are allocated for the electricity or for the transportation. So there has been reforms in the UAE, in Oman, and in Saudi Arabia. And also, I think one of the things that we need to think about when we think about fossil fuel subsidies and their removal or reduction is to think about the low-income groups. So with the fossil fuel subsidies, there is an issue of inequality because we are subsidizing everyone, and regardless of their income. But also one of the things that is also happening here in Saudi Arabia, there is what is called a citizen account, which ensure a transfer of cash for the low-income citizens. So in this way, we ensure, so in terms like when we look at it from a climate perspective, this would ensure a just transition. So nobody would be left behind. So maybe the issue also that we need to think about when we make the transition to alternative energy resources is perhaps if there are any job losses, how we could compensate for those ones. So I just wanted to add this point.
Thank you, Dr. Sarihi. So our time is coming to an end for this webinar. So if the panelists, they have final remarks that they want to share with the audience, please take a minute or two and go ahead. Dr. Farajalla?
Okay. First, it's been very interesting talking with the panelists as well and listening to their inputs and comments. And I'm sorry I was not able to address. I've just noticed that we've got a bunch of questions here. I am a natural optimist, so I will start with the optimism here. hopefully humanity will be able to curtail this crisis, climate crisis that we are suffering from. And in the within the near future, we will be able to relax a little bit. However, up until then, we need to do everything that we can, and we can do a lot, starting from the individual to the community, to the local government, to the national government, to a regional conglomeration, to work on reducing reliance on non-renewable energy and use the non-renewable energy that we do have in a constructive way to help us wean ourselves away from that. The Gulf countries are in the lead on this. They are pushing for renewable energy. There is a lot of intent, good intent. Just look at the 2030 vision by Saudi Arabia, or the different initiatives that are being put forward by the United Arab Emirates. These two countries are sufficient to give you hope that we will have a better future. But we really need to work on reducing our demand for everything, unneeded consumption of goods and products, of food. Food waste is terrible in the Gulf countries. We throw more than 70 to 75% of our food away. That's waste. We need to waste less and waste not even water. This is doable. It's not something that's very difficult. We start on our level and then ask our governments to act as well. So this is doable. We have a bright future. It's not so dark. Sometimes it gets dark, but then the people of the region are full of endeavor and they will make it happen. Let's start on our own first. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farajalla. Dr. D'Alessandro?
Thank you very much. I would continue as Dr. Farajalla was saying, and I am also an optimist for the region. And I'm optimist also because I have been seeing in these last years, in these, let's say, 5 years or so, things changing. I have witnessed the determination and the way in which things have been set in place and policies have been set in place in which, for example, when it comes to cities, for example, urban planning was a great concern in some cities. It was not easy and it was difficult really to change, but progressively it has been done, it is been doing, and I'm confident that the choices that have been done and the determination with which, for example, the private sector is being developed with the green economy has been moved forward, the innovation, the new technologies, for example, in construction. I think of the Qatar Green Building Council, for example, pushing for new building materials and new technologies, and of course the training of the youth. And the emphasis put in for example, in the Qatar National Vision 2030 in capacity, in individual capacity building. This is the way to follow and the determination to keep and the path to continue to be followed. And I'm confident that it will be done.
Thank you, Dr. D'Alessandro and Dr. Sarihi. Any final comments or observations?
Yeah, sure. So I will join Dr. Farajalla and Alessandro on also ending up with a positive remark or optimistic remark. So I think the way I would wrap up, I would go back to the question when we asked whether there is an example among the Gulf countries when it comes to their role of addressing the climate change. I think each Gulf country is presenting a good example for itself. I think moving forward and also in order to achieve the ambitions in the economic diversification, I think what we need to think more of, and we need to think on how addressing the climate change, both in terms of the mitigation and adaptation, how is it going to help actually on contributing the economic diversification, how is it going to bring economic, environmentally, and social advantages. This is my remark, and I also would like to thank everyone who is joining the discussion today. I'm looking at the questions. There are so interesting questions that we didn't answer, so I appreciate the questions and apologize that we couldn't answer all of them.
Thank you. Well, our time is up, and I am very happy that we are ending on a positive and optimistic note here. Yes, indeed, the climate challenges in the Gulf are huge, but the will and the vision of the people in the region is even larger and stronger. For example, I know, again, I'm more familiar with Qatar myself, that Qatar's QNV 2030, Qatar National Vision 2030, the government is moving fast towards that, and educational institutions at lower level, at higher level, they are all involved into moving the society towards this more of a sustainable economy and green economy into the future. And again, for our audiences, thanks for joining us. Sorry we couldn't answer all the questions. And for our esteemed panelists, thank you for being here with us and taking some time from your busy life and sharing your insights and knowledge about the topic with us today. On that note, I say goodbye to everybody and have a nice night or day and an afternoon wherever you are in this planet. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Thank you.